take your Bibles, if you go with me to Numbers chapter 9. Numbers chapter 9. This text is relevant for the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover season. Numbers chapter 9. It's not a text we read often at this time, but one we should, as it does have relevance. Numbers chapter 9, beginning in verse 1, says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year, after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Let the children of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month, at twilight, you shall keep it at its appointed time. According to all its rites and ceremonies, you shall keep it." So Moses told the children of Israel that they should keep the Passover. And they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, at twilight, in the wilderness of Sinai. According to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did. Now there was a certain men who were defiled by a human corpse, so that they could not keep the Passover on that day. And they came before Moses and Aaron that day. And these men said to him, "We became defiled by a human corpse. Why are we kept from presenting the offering of the Lord at its appointed time among the children of Israel?" And Moses said to them, "Stand still, that I may hear what the Lord will command concerning you." Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If any one of you or your posterity is unclean because of a corpse, or is far away on a journey, he may still keep the Lord's Passover. On the 14th day of the second month, at twilight, they may keep it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until morning, nor break one of its bones. According to all the ordinances of the Passover, they shall keep it. But the man who is clean and is not on a journey and ceases to keep the Passover, that same person shall be cut off from among his people, because he did not bring the offering of the Lord at its appointed time. That man shall bear his sin. And if a stranger dwells among you, and would keep the Lord's Passover, he must do so according to the rite of the Passover, and according to its ceremony. You shall have one ordinance, both for the stranger and the native of the land." Okay, this is called Pesach Sheni. Two stipulations. If they're on a faraway journey and can't make it back to Jerusalem, because this is a pilgrim festival, or if they're unclean. And in this particular situation, it's the most of the defiling of all uncleanness, which is corpse defilement. The person has touched a corpse or come across a corpse. They are unclean, that is, they can't go into the temple. So they can't then take their sacrifice in. What are they to do? So these men come to Moses, and they say, "Well, we're not going to be able to celebrate Passover because we're unclean. We've touched a corpse, or we had to bury somebody, or we came across a corpse." That renders them unable to go into the temple and bring their sacrifice. So they say, "Well, what are we supposed to do?" Moses says, "Well, I'm not exactly sure what we're supposed to do, so just hang on, I'll go talk to the Lord." He does this 4 times in the Torah, where he has to go back to the Lord and say, "Okay, what exactly are we supposed to do in this situation?" Which is okay. And the Lord gives him the answer. Tell them 1 month later, they're supposed to do everything that they would have done in the first month. Okay? Had they been able to keep it like everybody else, they have to do the same thing. Doesn't matter. So this is called Pesach Sheni, 1 month later. We really don't do anything with this one in our tradition. We don't really talk about it much. We don't really focus on it. We just kind of, it's there and okay, yeah.
Could somebody else have taken their offerings for them?
Yeah, I believe that was possible, that somebody could have taken it for them. Although if they're on a long journey and had not made those arrangements, they're in a faraway land in the diaspora, and they didn't have anybody to do it for them, that would be problematic. If they are corpse defiled, they could have somebody take it for them, but again, you have to arrange that. So if you haven't made those prior arrangements, then it would be difficult to set that up. But possible, yes, somebody could take it in for you if you weren't able to go yourself. It looks in this situation like that may not have been the situation. But here's what's interesting. God gives grace to say, if you're not unable to do it on the time that I set, I'll give you the grace to go 1 month later and do the same thing. Now what's fascinating is, because of this, or with this idea in mind, you had one of the kings of Israel who said, when the kingdom split, when we had northern kingdom and southern kingdom of Judah, northern kingdom of Israel, we had one king who said, this is a great idea. We'll move all the festivals 1 month later. This way nobody's keeping them at the same time. So, very fascinating what he tried to do, probably based on this idea. But I wanted you to see that oftentimes the Torah, we're told, well, the Torah is law. It's just law that just, there's no grace to it. It's all just law and commandments. But yet, here is grace to say, if you've contracted corpse defilement, which is the most defiling of all corpse defilement, of all the uncleanness, it's the mega defilement. You can't go into the temple. That's what it means. You just can't go into the temple. But you were required to go into the temple, to take your sacrifice in there, have it slaughtered there at the altar, and then take your animal and bring it back, roast it for Passover. Now, here's what's interesting. What do you think that they did with these skins from all these animals? You don't eat the skin. You don't eat the wool. Huh? Yeah, they make clothes. But what specifically? Yeah, you're right. They make clothes out of them. But you know what specifically they would do? We find this in history. The person who was hosting you for Passover, when you came in for Passover, was biblically not allowed to charge you since it was a festival. So it became customary to give your skins to those who were hosting you as a gift to them to say, thank you for hosting us and for allowing us to be here. So you'd make... Huh? Skins. So yeah, it was kind of it was a way of, give me some skin, Yeah, it was a way of thanking them without having to pay them, okay, without officially paying them. It was a kind of a nicety to give them the skin of the animal. So here's what happens. Your animal is, you take your animal now the blood has been put on the altar, you take it back and you roast it. We have unleavened bread for 7 days. Eat unleavened bread. Now, go with me to Luke chapter 2. Let's tie some stuff together. Yes? Yes. No, it's actually used in the Exodus narratives as well. The idea of twilight, between the evenings. They say between the evenings, which would be as the sun is going down from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. You have to understand something. It's different here than it is there. We need to talk about this too. The focus of this is always in the land of Israel. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Yeah, the camera will scan down to Egypt for a little bit because they're going to be in Egypt for a while. And Yeshua's going to go into Egypt. And the camera may scan up a little bit towards Turkey at the most. That's about it. It doesn't widen out that much. It stays pretty much there. And I said in his ministry, Yeshua doesn't go outside of Israel proper. And by that I mean this. The kingdom of Israel expanded the most during the time of David. That was the time they had the most land available to them that David was able to conquer. So Yeshua never goes outside of that. Most of the time Yeshua is in the Galilee. Beautiful up there. Gorgeous up in the Galilee. In fact, one of our pictures is from the temple at Capharnaum, which became Yeshua's favorite place to go. Peter lived there. It's right on the Sea of Galilee. Peter's mother-in-law lived there. They've excavated a house there at Capharnaum that they believe belonged to Peter's mother-in-law. Gorgeous place, right on the sea. And right above the Sea of Galilee is all these, right above it, above Capharnaum and above Tiberias, are all these places where Yeshua went. Nazareth, Bethany's a little bit further down, closer to but you have Magdala, you have Bethsaida, Chorazin, all these little villages up in the north. They're cute little hamlets, basically. And this is where he spent most of his time. Now, he would go down to Jerusalem for the festivals, but he stayed up in the Galilee most of the time. And if you go to Israel, you understand why. I can understand why he liked the Galilee. It's peaceful, it's serene, it's quiet. It's got this. There's something serene about being on the Sea of Galilee and just the quietness of the northern area. It's just beautiful area and it's quiet. You got a lot of hustle and bustle when you get to Jerusalem. Much more vibrant and hustle and bustle. But if you want quiet, if you want serenity, if you just want peace, you go to the Galilee. I can see why Yeshua liked it there. It's the greenery is beautiful there, plus you have the quiet. Now, go with me to Luke chapter 2. Let's tie some stuff in together. Luke chapter 2. This is speaking of Yeshua's parents. And so we'll show you some things here that are fascinating. Most of the time, this isn't focused on when we look at the birth of Yeshua, but here we're going to follow him just for a few moments, his life. Verse 21 of Luke chapter 2. Obviously, there's a lot here we could go into, but verse 21 of Luke chapter 2 says this, "And when 8 days were completed for the circumcision of the child, he was called Yeshua, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb." Remember what we've said? Angels are with Yeshua all the time because he is the Lord of hosts. That's a nice term, Lord of hosts. Sounds like he's got a towel and he's taking you to some, he's the host at some restaurant. It's not. That's not what the picture is. Changed when it says Lord of hosts in your Bible. Think Lord of armies. He's a warrior. So it's the host of his army. These angels are with him all the time. They're there at his birth. They're going to be there at his death. And we're going to see them all over the place in the meantime. And by the way, angels, angelos means messenger. Malach in Hebrew, messenger. Because they're called that when they come here. When they're not here, being sent, obviously, they're Elohim with a little e. They're Elohim. They are gods, so to speak, little g again, okay? But they are of this realm. They live up here. Now they can come down here, and when the Elohim come down, they are then Malach, angels, sent ones. However, those that have defected from the army of Ha Elohim, the living God, the El Elyon, the Most High, and have moved outside of his realm, we now call them in Greek diaman, which then comes into English as demon, okay, or unclean spirits. Same idea. Unclean spirits. Why they're unclean? They can't be clean. Okay, they can't come into the presence of God. Now, look at verse 22. Verse 22. Now, when the days of her purification, this is speaking of Miriam. There's at least 4 Miriams in the Bible, in the apostolic scriptures. Sometimes they get conflated. But there's actually 4 Miriams that are mentioned to us in the Bible. There's Miriam, the mother of Yeshua. There's Miriam. I'm saying Miriam instead of Mary, okay? Because Miriam was the sister of Moses. Therefore, it was a very popular name. So we have Mary, mother of Yeshua. We have Miriam. We have Miriam and Martha from Bethany. We have Miriam of Magdala, which is up in the Galilee. And we have Miriam who washes the feet of Yeshua with her hair. Those are 4 Marys. 4 Miriams. Now, we shouldn't just say, well, they're all the same. They're all the same. It was 4 different individuals and 4 different people. So it's not, we don't want to conflate them. All right, so we're talking about Miriam here. When the days of her purification, according to the Torah of Moses, were completed. This speaks of Leviticus chapter 12. Leviticus chapter 12 says that when a woman has had a child, she's unclean for a certain period of days, 33 plus 7 if it's a boy, 66 plus 14 if it's a girl. And she has to then go and do a purification. She has to take a mikvah, an immersion, which is where the Christian idea of baptism comes in. Baptizo, they just transliterated it. Didn't want to say We can let them translate it, but we'll just transliterate it. Baptizo means immersion, though. Okay, it comes from this idea of going into the water. Why? You wash away, metaphorically, the uncleanness. It has to be in Mayim Kaim, living water. So Miriam, the mother of Yeshua, goes and does a ritual immersion. Now notice this. And I didn't even talk about, in verse 21, the fact that circumcision, we looked at that last week and how that relates to Passover. You have to be circumcised in order to ultimately celebrate Passover. To ultimately celebrate, you have to be circumcised. Jeremiah 44, what does he say? One day, everybody will be circumcised in heart and in flesh. That will be required of everybody. Verse 22, back to that, he says this in verse 23. He says, as it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. Now here's what happens. Since she's had a child, I'm going to give you the references. Numbers, well, we'll turn to these in just a moment. Numbers chapter 13, verses 11 through 16. Exodus 13, 11 through 16. Exodus 13, 11 through 16. And Numbers 3, 38 through 51. The Torah requires that if you have a firstborn male, whether it's an animal or whether it's a son, human being, that they be redeemed. Okay? Now, what's interesting is, how do you redeem these? How do you redeem these animals? Anybody want to take a guess at how we do this? What do you think the Torah says? No. Well, let's divide. How do animals? And by the way, a couple weeks from now we'll talk about Leviticus 11. How do we divide animals? What kind of animals do we have? Clean and unclean. All right. So what if I have a firstborn of a clean animal? Have a firstborn of a clean animal that can go onto the altar. It has to go on the altar. It has to go to the Lord. If it's a firstborn of an unclean animal, I can't take it and put it on the altar, so I offer a clean animal for it to redeem it. Who's beeping? It's okay. Okay. All right. So, what if I have a firstborn son, though? How do I redeem the firstborn son? Human being. Huh? His sister, his kid sister. No, not his kid sister. How do we... Huh? Not the half shekel, but you're close. 5 shekels. 5 silver shekels have to be brought to the sanctuary to redeem the male firstborns. Okay? All right. But not only that, because this is required, the tribe of Levi stood in for the firstborn as well. So the tribe of Levi was taken for the firstborn when they came out of Egypt. He says, "I'll take the tribe of Levi as the sacrifice." Now they were a little short, so they were about 275 people short. So they had to bring 5 shekels for each of these 275 people. Okay, he took the tribe of Levi though as the firstborn. They were going to be dedicated to him to serve in the temple. But from there on out, you had to pay 5 shekels, 5 silver shekels, according to the way to the sanctuary, for every firstborn male child born. So Joseph and Miriam, it says, every male who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. By the way, here's grace again. The Torah said, if you can't bring a bull, or if you can't bring a sheep or a lamb, you can bring turtle doves or pigeons, which tells us the economic status of Joseph and Miriam. They weren't very wealthy. They're bringing birds. Okay? All right. Now, notice this. In verse 39, so when they had performed all things according to the Torah of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city, Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Now look at this. Verse 41. His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. They went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. So this is the first time we see Yeshua, other than his birth. We have him here. We have his birth narratives. Then we have him here at 12 years old. The one thing we know about his parents, they're very, very meticulous in their observance of the Torah. They're doing the purifications. They're bringing the offerings. They're making sure he's circumcised. They're going up to the festivals. So his parents are keeping these festivals. And the first recorded instance we have of Yeshua after his birth is at Passover. He goes up to Passover, and obviously they come down from Nazareth. They come down as a group. And as they come down as this chavarah, as this group of people, they leave Yeshua in Jerusalem thinking he's in the group somewhere. They think that he's in the group, figuring, okay, since he's with our people, he's probably just, even though we haven't seen him, somebody's taking care of him. He's 12 years old. Not like he's a young child. And they find him in the temple. And it's fascinating because then they have to come back to Jerusalem. They stayed there for the week of unleavened bread. And they come back to Jerusalem and they say, what's going on with you? Why weren't you in the group? Why didn't you leave when we left? He'd gotten so caught up in answering questions and in debating with these sages. And he says to them, to Miriam, didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business? What a fascinating text. All right. Any questions on that in these texts? Yes? Oh, he's 12. According to what we can tell historically, the concept of bar and bat mitzvahs is a later idea. It's a much more modern concept. It's not really considered a. No, not really. Not that we could tell. Not historically. I mean, the concept of bar and bat mitzvah is much more modern. So it's not something we see them doing. We don't even hear of a bar and bat mitzvah in the Mishnah or the Talmud. We don't hear it in the Tosefta. So I mean, these concepts are later ideas. He's certainly considered old enough that they think he's with the group and he can figure it out himself. So he's old enough to leave behind in the sense that he'll be okay if they leave him behind. But he's so enamored with the temple that he just loses track of time and doesn't even go with the group. This tells us a lot about him. And he sees his parents keeping Passover. All right. Any other questions or comments? I don't know what the name Miriam means. That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure. Great question. I don't know. We know from history that it's one of the most popular names in the first century for women. Extremely popular because of Moses' sister. But as far as what it means, that's a great question. I'll have to look it up. I didn't even look it up to see. I don't know. Good question. Yes. Well, actually, they'd only gotten about a day and a half out. And they said, as the text says, they got about a day and a half out, and they started to look for him amongst their group. Yeah, so they had to go back. They had to backtrack, though. This is why they're worried. I got to tell you, those of you that are parents know this. There's nothing worse than to have one of your children lost and not know where they are, and then that panic that sets in when you think to yourself, I have no idea. I brought them with me, and I don't know where they are. And you know what the irony is? That doesn't really, to some extent, it doesn't matter how old they are. I mean, it does and it doesn't. I mean, the older they get, and you know that they can take care of themselves. But one time, I lost Leah. Leah was one to get lost. I went to a big store, and I thought Leah was right behind me. Danielle was right behind me. Leah was right behind me. They were little. They're about 4 and 5. About 4 and 5. And I said to Danielle, I said, "Where's Leah?" She goes, "I don't know." I said, "Well, wasn't she just right here with us?" I mean, I literally turned back around, she was gone. And I started running up and down the aisles, panicking, thinking, where is she? Where is she? She'd gotten fascinated. She made it to the front door of this big supermarket. She made it to the front door, and she was fascinated by the fact that if you stepped on the pad, the door would open. So she'd step off the pad, watch the door open, that's where I found her. She was fascinated by this door opening by just stepping on this thing. one time she got lost. I think it was Leah that got lost at the Puyallup Fair. And we were again in panic trying to find her. Thankfully, she had made it to the children's place where they go, and if you're a lost child, somebody had taken her there because she was crying. Thankfully, it was a person but the fair is a very creepy place with a lot of creepy people. And so when losing her there, you're just going to panic. And actually, one of the guys from our congregation saw her, and they said to her, "Is that your dad?" And she says, "No." And because he said Leah like that, and they wouldn't let him take her, which is good. So had to show that you're a parent and that you have the same name. And so anyway, losing a child is never a fun thing. Yeah, we've lost. If you think, just the whole notion of we've lost him. Where's he at? You go back through the group and you're going, do you have him? Have you seen him? No, I haven't seen him. Did you see him when we left? No, I didn't see him. Have anybody seen him? No. And they're going through the whole group, and then you're thinking, we're a day and a half out. That means we got another day and a half back. That's just 3 days that we haven't seen him. So the panic that's in you as a parent is like, ay. So you can understand why when they got to him, they said, why'd you do this to us? He's like, well, I didn't do anything to you. It's like, well, you didn't leave with the group. He says, well, didn't you know? Here's what he said. Didn't you know where I'd be?
So even Mary and Joseph were looking for the
Yeah, they're looking for him. But he says, didn't you know where I'd be? I'd be in my Father's house. Really? This is where I'd be. All right.
It shows also that Mary and Joseph, as you said before, followed the Torah. John 2, they obviously not Jesus as son, because at that age he knew all that he had been taught, and he was able to debate with them.
Right. Yeah. Star of the Sea. Okay, there you go. Star of the Sea. See, isn't technology wonderful? We can just... All right. So, Star of the Sea, maybe. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. Yeah, that understands technology. I didn't grow up with all this technology. All right. So, let's talk about... You can Star of the Sea, too? Okay, there we go. Star of the Sea. Miriam. Okay. All right. Some thoughts to think about as we go through, as we've worked through Passover. I want to talk about this just for a little bit. I'll try to go through these quickly. While we often refer to the 10 plagues that came against Egypt, we must not forget that within the text of Exodus, they are called judgments. The God of Israel had judged the nation of Egypt and gave them multiple opportunities to release his firstborn. While a Hebrew word for plagues is found in the Exodus narratives, the words for judgments is more frequent. The word plague, Exodus 11:1, could lead one to believe that what happened to Egypt were just random acts of nature or the normal difficulties that come with living life. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every one of the 10 judgments came directly from the hand of God. They're called judgments. Yes?
Yeah, I think that they are judgments, because the first thing that Pharaoh said to Moses and Aaron, he said, who am I that I should respect your God?
Exactly.
I've got lots of gods here.
Right. Exactly. And in fact, the text...
One by one, judging those gods.
Exactly. That's the point. Each one of the gods of Egypt in their pantheon is judged. And that's the key. Number 2, I said the judgments against the nation of Egypt were designed to demonstrate the inferiority of Egypt's gods. Every one of the judgments meted out reflected another attack on an Egyptian deity within the religious pantheon. Exodus 12:12. Judgment by judgment, the God of Israel was demonstrating that he and he alone had the ability to exercise his sovereignty. The gods of Egypt proved powerless to stop the judgments against him. Within the nation, the Pharaoh was believed to be a demigod who possessed divine attributes. But even Pharaoh proved powerless to stem the tide of judgments levied against him and his people. One message coming from the Exodus is clearly, there is no God that can stand against the God of Israel. It's clear. And he wants to make that clear to his people and to the Egyptians. No one can stand against me. By the way, each of these little deities that Egypt worships are little Elohim. They are demonic forces. They are demonic forces. Within the judgments against Egypt, her gods and Pharaoh, the power of God was manifested to the nation of Israel. Plagues 4 through 9 did not occur in areas where the Israelites lived, but only occurred in the areas where Egyptians lived. So from the fourth plague forward, all the way through 4 through 9, God was able to say, I can cause this to happen here, but I can keep it from happening here. So he can show his judgment and divide between who it goes to. All right. Closely attached to the Passover is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For 7 days, no bread with leaven is to be eaten, and every dwelling is to be rid of its presence. What is the purpose of eating unleavened bread? Unleavened bread reminds us of the time when we were not our own. It reminds us of the constraints of slavery, where our time belonged to the Egyptians and we moved at their bidding. So hurried was the exodus from Egypt that the bread had to be cooked before it could rise. So Exodus 12:39 states this. So we eat unleavened bread today. It's a feast of unleavened bread. So we have Passover as the event, but then there's the week-long unleavened bread from the 15th through the 21st. Now, here's what's happened. Here's what happened. In the diaspora, the reason why we ended up with 8 days is because of the diaspora. The rabbis said to us, and we're still the recipients of their rulings at times, and still trying to work through it. They said, you're going to do every festival you're going to do at the beginning of it, you're going to do 2 days, so that you make sure that you have the right sighting of the moon, except for Yom Kippur. So here's what happens. If you say, we're going to do the first night of Passover, then the second night, then you're going to have to do 6 days. So you're going to end up with 6 plus the 2, you're going to end up with 8 instead of 7. So that's why we end up with 8 in the Orthodox counting. You end up with 8 because the rabbi said, celebrate Passover on 2 days. So you have a Pesach 1 and Pesach 2. The biblical text only said Passover 1. Now the rabbis come along later on and say, well, we're not sure, so let's add this other day at the beginning of it. That's why we end up with 8. But if you count if you got from 15 to and you count 7, you end up with 21. That's what you're supposed to have. Now, admittedly, the rabbis have come in, and that's why the Orthodox do the 8th day. Okay? Yes?
Well, the scripture says they started at the evening of the 14th, which is actually the 15th.
Again,
Is that not really Passover, but it's just the preparation?
Preparation for it. So you end up with 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. That's your 15th to the 21st. No. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. From 15 and 7 is 21. You start the evening of the 14th, yes. You start the evening of the 14th. That's when the lamb is slaughtered. But then the 15th, he says from the 15th to the 21st. So that's the actual. Now, we added a day in the diaspora because of the rabbis. But you slaughtered the animal on the night of the 14th, between the evening and the 14th. Okay? Here's what happened, though. Here's a little clue thing. Because Jerusalem was so filled with, they say that there may have been upwards of 3 or 4 million at some points in Israel's history coming to Egypt. Coming to Israel to celebrate Passover. There was no way you could start at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 14th and have everybody's lamb done by 6 p.m. So there were some people who were coming up to 2 days ahead of time and having their lamb slaughtered because there was no way that you could get all of them done in a 3-hour time period, even if you had every priest on duty serving. So just the sheer numbers would have required you to, at certain points in Israel's history, would have required you to have other times where they could come in prior to the 14th and slaughter their lamb, put it on the altar, and then take their hide. They would still celebrate it on the same day with everybody else, but the slaughter itself would have had to have happened before that because you just didn't have enough priests. Every priest is required to serve at the 3 pilgrim festivals. But when you get 1 million people coming in, actually over 1 million people, by some accounts historically, there's no way you're going to have everybody there at the same time and get all of it done. just time-wise, you don't have enough time.
If you had, okay, let's say you got a family, let's just say a family of 10.
Yes.
Multiple sons, multiple daughters, and small family. Would they only sacrifice one lamb for the entire family?
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes, yes, just for one for the 10.
I'm just thinking it's not even possible to do within 3 days if you're going to do one lamb per person.
Yeah. No, not for every person, but everybody had to have a little piece. Had at least some amount of it. Yeah, about one per 10. But still, if you have some historic accounts say that the Israel and surrounding area ballooned up to between 3 and 4 million people. Well, if that happens, there's no way. Even if you do 1 in 10, the sheer numbers are such that you're not going to be able to do every one of them between 3 and 6 o'clock on the 14th.
Josephus records that there were 625,000 lambs.
Yeah, one of Josephus' reports says that it got up to 625. Yeah, so I mean, that's a lot of lambs. I don't care who you are. And the process by which they did this, they also talk about how that they had to have them in rows so that you would come in sections and then you would go to different sections. And so it was quite a lengthy process. In other words, to slaughter it, put the blood on there, take out the entrails, give you the skin back with the main part of the meat, and to get everybody in and everybody handled was a lengthy. It wasn't just something you could just run in there and do real quick.
Well, you had one representative per family.
Yeah, you take one person per family, 1 or 2 per family. So it's not something you can just get in there and do real quick. Well, you could start. Well, they probably did it. We do have them doing it the days before, from earlier. We do have them doing it earlier, noon to 3. Yeah, you could, and actually before that, you could do it. Once the morning sacrifice was offered, you could start. So once that started, they would do it. But yeah, so I mean, but we know that they had to be doing it before, just for the sheer numbers, before the 14th, before the evening of the 14th. Yeah, and I think there's even records that they started sometimes days before, a couple days before that, just because of the sheer amount. Yeah.
The first time they had Passover, they slaughtered the animal, but they left it with its entrails and everything all intact. They roasted it with them.
Yes, although certain things had to be.
Well, I was hoping you say that. That seemed kind of. But can you subsequent, then they actually slaughtered properly and it's clean prior to roasting? Is that what you're saying? Only the Exodus and the original Exodus was really time to have it intact when they roasted it? Is that?
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yes. All right, number 5 on my list for those of you that have the notes. According to the Talmud, and I wouldn't even have to use the Talmud for this. The biblical text says it as well. Each individual in every generation should understand that they too were redeemed from Egypt. If the retelling of the story becomes just about them and what they did, then we have lost touch with our heritage. The exodus from Egypt not only affected them, but had reverberations for us as well. We must all see our wives, our children, our community, and ourselves as having come out of Egypt. We must all see ourselves as connected with those who came before us and on whose shoulders we have stood. I'm going to skip down to number 7. We must not forget that a mixed multitude, here's the key, a mixed multitude left Egypt the night the nation of Israel escaped. The word for mixed in Exodus 12:38 reflects those of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. While the Exodus did primarily affect the nation of Israel, there were more than just Israelis that left Egypt that eventful night. Our God was not only dealing with Israelis and making a way out for them, but also those of every ethnic race, Jew and Gentile alike. Once again, the power of God was demonstrated in the release not only of his own people, but also to everyone who identified with them. That's key. So not only was Israel coming out that night, but nations were coming out with them. May have been as many of the other nations as there was Israelis. How many came out? We know that there were 600,000 plus foot soldiers that come out. So if you gave every foot soldier one wife and let's say one kid to be conservative, at that point you have almost 2 million people. So right there you got good numbers. Okay, I mean we could probably bump it up. I mean they didn't have just one kid, most of these families. So if you gave them 2 kids, you're looking at 2.4 million. So, yeah, we had a lot of sheep and goats. All right, a lot of cattle. Number 8, the purpose of our redemption was not so we could all go around and claim our freedom. He did not free us for freedom's sake. Our freedom has a purpose and a goal. The reason he redeemed us so that we could worship him in the manner that he desired. As slaves, our time, energy, and efforts were exhausted in building monuments to Pharaoh. But that was not the purpose for which we were created. We were created to praise God and bring glory to his name. The freedom we have in the Messiah allows us to give our energy and time to serving him through obedience to his Torah. Remember, this is connected by 49 days to Shavuot, where he gives us the commandments. So we have Passover, our deliverance, our redemption, that's then connected to Shavuot 49 days later, where he then brings us to Mount Sinai and gives us the commandments. He's okay. If you need to lay down, go ahead. That's fine. All right. Number 10. Passover was designed for the community of faith. Passover was designed for those who had placed their faith in the God of Israel and were willing to be obedient to his commands. Exodus 12 tells us that for future generations, only those males who are circumcised could eat of the Passover lamb. Circumcision was a sign of the covenant that God had established with Abraham, and thus the Passover was a demonstration of God's covenant faithfulness to provide and protect his children. Prior to bringing Moshe to Egypt, the Holy One had confronted Moshe on the requirement of having his own son circumcised. The linking of circumcision with the Exodus and Passover demonstrates that the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant were being welded together. That's key. These covenants are not just little pieces of pie all to themselves. The very fact that the Abrahamic covenant, circumcision, is linked to Passover in the Mosaic covenant tells us that they're being wedded together. If you're going to celebrate Passover, which is in the Mosaic covenant, you have to have circumcision, which is in the Abrahamic covenant. You have to identify with Abraham and Moses. And you have to be in Abraham first. That's huge. All right. Number 12 says this. Exodus reminds us that our God is doing a work in us that we can't see. As Israel left Egypt, God made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward his people, and they were given articles of gold, silver, and clothing. Perhaps many Israelites thought that they had won the lottery, or that they had finally gotten what was due them. However, as one reads the book of Exodus at large, God was giving them these things so that they could eventually build a tabernacle where his presence could be in their midst. I am convinced that the purposes and intentions of God are often hidden from us, and our human eyes often do not see his overall plan. On the last night in Egypt, the Israelites plundered their captors and gained the needed material that would build a tabernacle for the dwelling of God. Our God is moving in directions that we don't comprehend, but his ways are righteous and always for the betterment of his children. In other words, not everything can be seen by us. But God is always doing a work in and through us to bring about his purposes. So he gives the children of Israel gold and silver and clothing. And they think, hey, this is great. This is awesome. This is neat. You know? But he's going to ask them for this stuff later on to say, I want you to build me a house. I want you to build me a place where I can dwell amongst you. Let me put it this way. God doesn't waste time on us. He doesn't waste time on us. There's an old song that used to say it this way. He didn't bring us this far to leave us. He didn't teach us to swim to let us drown. He didn't build his home in us to move away. He didn't lift us up to let us down. In other words, he doesn't waste experiences on us. You have those deja vu moments where you think to yourself, okay, that's why he wanted me to do this. Or that's why he brought me to this situation. Because everything God is doing, he says, the steps of a righteous man are ordered by the Lord. I hope that your prayer when you get up in the morning is this. Lord, bring me across the path of those who I need to minister to, or those that you want me to minister to. Make me intersect with people that you want me to intersect with. and that you want me to speak to, that you want me to minister your word to. And when that happens, give me the words to say. So that I'm meeting the people you want me to meet and saying the things you want me to say. And you know what he'll do? He'll do that. You'll meet and it'll be those kind of moments where you go, that's just a God moment. It's one of those moments where you know, I couldn't have organized this. I couldn't have orchestrated this. This had to be him. And the things that he gives you, are not so that you can have things. They're so that you can advance the kingdom of God. Yes. Right. That's my point. He doesn't give us things so that we can have things. He gives us things so that we can worship him and serve him. If all we do is there's a lot of people that have things, and they get more things, and they have more stuff. They get more money, and they buy more stuff. And they got a lot of stuff. And now, in our brilliance, we have places where, because your house gets too big for this stuff, you can go store your stuff somewhere else. So now we're building storage places, so we don't want to get rid of our stuff. So we'll pay somebody to store our stuff. We'll pay $100 a month or more so somebody can store our stuff, because we don't have enough place for our stuff. So but the thing is, the reason we have stuff is not so we can have stuff. It's so that we can serve him. And if what you are given isn't used for the kingdom of God, it's becoming idolatrous, or it is idolatrous. It's moving that direction real quick. In other words, how many of us, don't raise your hand, I'm not asking this for a raise your hand. How many of you have more clothes in your closet than what you need? And how many of you have clothes in your closet that you probably haven't worn in years? Don't answer. Go around your house and look at some of the things that you have, or your garage. That's even a better place. The attic or garage. And look at the stuff and see how long it's been since you used it last. And ask yourself, what's the purpose of all this stuff? Huh? You need a feel-good mess. You want something feel-good now. Okay. So now I'll move on to feel-good stuff. Yeah, that's meddling. I know. That's meddling. I know. That is meddling. I know. But man, we got more stuff, man. Oh my stars. We got so much stuff. All right. But my point is this too, that he gives us the stuff to move us towards him, not to move us away from him. If the stuff moves us away from him, it's idolatrous. Yeah, well, actually, for the homeless, I mean, you know what? Go through your closets and think to yourself, look, I know what happens. I know what people think. They have this whole closet full of clothes, and you look at some of these clothes, you haven't worn them in years, and you're thinking to yourself, well, that's a size that I want to get back to, and you haven't been in that size for a long time, and you're thinking, well, but someday if I ever get back there. Yeah, or it's the style. Yeah, if I wait long enough, it'll come back in style. You know what? This morning, opening temperatures for this area was 37 degrees. That's cold. So wouldn't it be better for somebody to have your clothes that could be warm with it, that needs it, than it's sitting in your closet? Wouldn't it be better to have somebody staying alive than sitting there? What happens to it? It's moth and rust. But here's the other thing. The thing is this, that everything God does in your life, everything he's doing, is to prepare you for something else. He's always building and preparing you for something else. He's not wasting anything on you. It's not as if God's just saying, well, I got nothing better to do, so I'm going to bring this circumstance into your life. No, he's doing it for a purpose to bring you to someplace else. It's always forward moving. All right, last thing, because this comes up at this time of year. A final, especially since we're going to have tomorrow, will be one of those days, one of those 2 times a year, that churches all over this city will be packed. Okay? So tomorrow places are going to be packed. And you won't be able to get into any restaurants tomorrow once it comes 11:30. The restaurants will be packed and the churches will be packed. Ironically, both for the same reasons. Number 17. A final question we should ask regarding Passover is, did Paul and the early believers keep celebrating Passover after Yeshua's death? Many well-meaning evangelical believers assume that after Yeshua's death, the Passover was no longer kept or was replaced with the Eucharist. According to Acts 12:4, Herod delayed in putting Peter to death because he wanted to wait until Passover or unleavened bread was completed. Here we have evidence that the early believers were still keeping the festival of Passover following the death of Yeshua. We know from Acts 2 that the festival of Pentecost, Hebrew Shavuot, was being observed by devout followers of Yeshua. Throughout the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul is portrayed as one who keeps the weekly Sabbath, Acts 17:2, desires to keep the Torah feasts of Pentecost and Shavuot, Acts 20:16, and along with Yom Kippur, and is willing to offer sacrifices in the temple when the need arises. And all of this after the death of Yeshua. There are 2 texts within the book of Corinthians that deserve our attention due to their relationship with Passover. In 1 Corinthians 5:6-8, Paul writes, "Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." Here the Apostle Paul, writing to believers of Corinth, had the perfect opportunity to assert that Passover was no longer necessary or had been replaced with another means of remembering the atonement of Yeshua. Yet Paul refuses to abolish or replace Passover, but takes the events of Passover as a time to speak of cleaning out one's life of things that separate us from God. We have mentioned that Passover and unleavened bread are connected within the Hebrew Scriptures and Apostolic Scripture. In preparation for the arrival of Passover unleavened bread, every house would have cleaned out all the leaven so that it would be gone by the time of Passover. This annual cleaning out the leaven was a perfect metaphor for the need of everyone to clean out the sin in one's life on a regular basis. Now, I'm not saying that leaven and sin are the same thing, but the idea was the metaphor. The second text in 1 Corinthians that overlaps with Passover is 1 Corinthians 11:23-24. This text has been used by many to say that Passover was being replaced by the Lord's Supper. A question that begs to be asked is, in light of Paul's personal observance of the Moedim in Acts, that is Shavuot, Yom Kippur, and his endorsement of Passover in 1 Corinthians 5, is Paul recording a new event in 1 Corinthians 11? The first rule of interpretation is context. The context of Paul's comments in 1 Corinthians 11 are, he says this, "The Lord Yeshua on the night he was betrayed," which places the rest of Paul's comments in the text back to the Passover, where all the gospel authors anchored the timing of Yeshua's death. For Paul to come along and create a new event with no introduction or basis in the life of Yeshua or the Hebrew Scripture would have been rejected by the believing community, or at least thoroughly scrutinized. The fact that Paul feels no need to explain this meal means that he expects his readers to understand the pre-existing context that informs his comments. It should be noted also that further contextual evidence for this meal being a Passover is the quote Paul places in the mouth of Yeshua, which only occurred during the last Passover Yeshua attended. For someone to claim that Paul is introducing a new festival in 1 Corinthians 11 requires ignoring 2 significant contextual markers within the immediate context and a third contextual marker in the larger context of 1 Corinthians, that is chapter 5, where he mentions Passover. So, the question becomes, yes to the issue that eventually when the Jews and the Gentiles split, we had the separation of Sabbath and Sunday, and then we had the separation of the festivals. So that you had Gentiles going towards, after about the 3rd century, moving towards the Eucharist, that is just the blood and the bread, the grape juice and the bread. And yes, the separation was occurring. And the separation actually started in the 1st century. But we don't see any evidence in the Scriptures that they were moving to something completely new and creating something completely new. That just doesn't happen, not in the biblical text. It happens in church history, but not in the biblical text. Yes?
Is there a scriptural basis for the frequency of this doing? If we do prayer Tuesday every Sabbath?
That's more of a tradition that I like to do, but has nothing to do with Has nothing to do with communion. That's more of that was the tradition within Judaism to have a blessing of the bread and the wine before you ate. But that has nothing to do with doing communion. And we don't, to answer your question, no, we don't have anything. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, the example is Yeshua in the last dinner. He said he blessed the food, he blessed the bread, and he blessed the wine as actually a bracha.
Yeah, he did a bracha for the bread and the wine, but there's nothing that says. I mean,
It's just an example.
yeah, right. But he does it in the context of Passover. It's not in the context of a separate event. It does become a separate event in church history.
I'm not asking from the perspective of separation of the event as much as, like, you go to a Catholic service, they do it as part of an oath, they do it every service. Or some churches do it every Sunday, or every, they just throw it in there once in a while.
Right.
Or is there any specific that we're...
I've never found anything that says that you're required to do it, yeah. Other, right. 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 That's kind of the thinking is that whenever you do this, but it wasn't like whenever you do this and do this, whenever you want to. I mean, there's specifically laid out when you do these things and the dates that you do them. So, you don't have anything that tells you.
What you're talking about in terms of frequency and when you're, that's a division formula in all denominations.
It is. Sure. Oh, my stars.
That's what I'm asking. I mean, outside of Passover, I don't actually have any command as to when we were to do that.
No, you don't have anything that tells you. Church history, yes. Church history, but no scripture. And every denomination will come up with its own history to tell you when to do these things and when not to do these things, but nothing in the biblical text. So it's one of those things that it became a separation, and it also became a replacement. So if you look at a Catholic Mass or even a Lutheran Mass, it's basically distilled Passover. That's what they're doing. They're distilling Passover. They're taking the bread, taking the wine. Although they started saying some things about it that got really hokey, very hokey. So it's like, no, it doesn't become the actual body and blood. You had transubstantiation, consubstantiation. It's like, whoa, started getting really creepy on what it meant. It represents the body and represents the blood, fine, but not. It doesn't become it. Yes. Okay, that's fine, which is fine. I was just in a Lutheran church. Yeah. No. Sure. Right. Right, and that is. But he's not into cannibalism. Right. He's not, because anybody looking at the Hebrew Scripture would have said. Clearly, he's not talking. He's using this as metaphors. The bread is a metaphor for his body, and the blood is a metaphor for his. The wine is a metaphor for his blood, because you have red wine. Okay, the bread, and even Yeshua is using this. He's using the bread as a metaphor for himself. I'm the bread who came down from heaven. So he's not saying that he's actually physically bread. Right. I don't think it becomes in you, the bread, the body and blood, and that gets. Yeah, it gets too mystical for me. I mean, I don't see that. I mean, he's saying in other words, I don't think when I take grape juice that becomes the blood of Christ, or that when I take a unleavened wafer that becomes the body of Christ. I think it represents him, but I don't think it becomes him. And I think that language of it becoming him or becoming his blood was language that was from the Gentile side of the aisle. Yeah, because it would be if. Yes, it does. She brings up a good point. The word remembrance is a zikaron in Hebrew. Zikaron. I'm trying to remember what the word is in Greek. It's I can see the word. I'm trying to think how to pronounce it. Anyway, it's a memorial. In other words, he says that this is a memorial of what happened in the Exodus. So, going back to your question for a minute, it's a great question. There was from the perspective of the Hebrew Scriptures, it would have been absolutely unthinkable that one could ever drink blood. In fact, all blood has to go back into the ground. If you're going to sacrifice it for the purposes of your own eating, we'll come to that in Leviticus 11 next week, or week following. And if you're going to sacrifice an animal in the temple, all that blood has to go on the altar. And so he makes it very clear that blood goes into the ground and belongs to God, because it's Leviticus 17:11, the life of the flesh is in the blood. So it would seem impossible for me to think in terms of that if I were to drink this glass of wine representing his blood, that it would become his blood. That would be, from a Hebrew's perspective, that would be cannibalistic. They would think that that's as cannibalistic. They would go, absolutely not. I think it can represent clearly. I have no problem with my Lutheran and Catholic friends that say we use it to represent. My only problem with them at that point is that they then are using it to replace Passover, because they don't do Passover. They replace it and say, well, we're going to condense it and then replace it, and do it. And instead of seeing it as the full orbed meal that it was a meal, with unleavened bread, which they kept the unleavened bread part, but they didn't have roasted. They don't have the roasted herbs. They don't have the lamb. There's a lot of things that just don't go with it. So, and then it becomes some kind of something mystical within both Catholic and Lutheran traditions that I don't think it was mystical, and I think it's spiritual but not mystical. And that's the part I would have where I would kind of divide and say, yes, there's spiritual elements to it, but not a mystical element to it. Go, sure. No, it's fine. That's what this is about. Believe me, your questions are other people's questions. In what way did it? Yeah, and I think there was a lot of, that's a deep question. She said, why did a number of people walk away when he said you must, eat my bread, drink my, I think here's a couple reasons. First of all, one of the things I think Yeshua is saying is this, and this is what, you have to go back to the time period. By the way, let's do that just for a second. Think about Passover. What is Passover actually saying if you're living in a Roman culture? If you're living in a Roman culture and you see all these Jews coming into Israel to celebrate Passover, and you're a Roman soldier or you're a Roman leader, and they're talking about liberation. Hey, we broke away from our slave owners. This commemorates our coming out of Egypt. We threw off the yoke of Egypt, and we became our own people. And the Romans are going, they threw off the yoke, and they got rid of their oppressors. Well, we're a yoke, and we're one of the oppressors. This does not bode well for us. So here's what would happen. And they want a king. So Rome would beef up the security at Passover. And we know from secular historians that it wasn't unusual for the Romans to actually go down towards the temple area and cause a little problem and get a riot started. So now you got Yeshua, who comes in on this donkey, Zechariah 9:9, and people are saying, save us now, rescue us. And he's got a big crowd with him, and he's coming to the temple, and Rome's looking at all this going, So we got this guy who thinks he's a king, huh? And by the way, what are they going to put over the cross? The reason why we kill him? King of the Jews. So he's the king of the Jews. This is what we do to kings. Anybody who wants to be a king, this is what we'll do to you. We'll just put this down and quash this right now. So Rome is on edge because you've got all these people ballooning into Jerusalem, and you have this feast that celebrates insurrection. The throwing off of, we celebrate Independence Day. We generally don't go and get the British people to come celebrate with us. Let's bring the Queen of England over and have her celebrate Independence Day. No. They don't like, the Brits aren't really thrilled about our, independence. That we were throwing off their yoke. Now, we don't even talk about that anymore, but the bottom line is that this is the climate that it's happening in. So to answer your question, when he says, if you don't drink my blood and eat my flesh, you have no part of me, I think he's saying, look, a couple things. Number one, I'm going to suffer. Judas says, you know what? They think he's going to, the disciples think, this is in their head. And this is why you see the two on the road to Emmaus and others disillusioned, because they think what he's going to do is, he's ridden into Jerusalem, and we have all these texts in the Hebrew Scripture that say there's a day coming when we will have a king, and he will throw off the yoke of our oppressors, and he will be triumphant. And when Yeshua is saying to them, hey, he rides into Jerusalem, and there's all this fervor because all the people are there, they're thinking, great, take the kingdom, man. Take the kingdom. And he says, guys, it's not going to happen right now. And Judas says to him, you know what? I'm getting off this gravy train. Forget this mess. I'm going to get as much money out of this as I can and be done with this. If this is what he thinks this is about, if this is about dying, some martyr for some cause, whatever, There's no glory in being a martyr unless you're dead, But that doesn't do you any good until you're dead. So if Yeshua wants to be a martyr, let him go do it. Judas takes off. And I think he's saying to his disciples, you know what, hey, look, guys, by the way, every one of these disciples dies a very, very, according to history, dies a very tragic death. You guys understand what you're signing up for here? Every one of you are going to die a death that's very, very tragic. History tells us that all of them died in a way that was very difficult. Except for John. But
he was exiled.
He's exiled.
Which is nothing.
And to the Isle of Patmos. Okay. But you have, some of them are crucified upside down. Some of them are, the deaths that these disciples go through. So he's saying to them, I think, hey, look, do you really understand what I'm about? And that there's going to be suffering and tragedy before there's glory, before there's exaltation and glory. Are you ready for that? And I think that are you willing to identify with me in my suffering, the body and the blood, which is my suffering? That this body is going to be pierced and this blood is going to be shed. Are you willing to identify with that kind of death and a tragic death and a what Rome did? The way they put people to death, very, very incredible. I mean, so. Are you willing to be a part of that and understand that this movement is going in that direction? It's going to get worse before it gets better. Rome doesn't like what we're doing, and in fact, we're going to have the rebellion in 66. We're going to have the rebellion in 132, and Rome's going to quash this whole thing. Which, by the way, what that does is it pushes all the Jewish people up to Tiberias and then back to Babylon. And this is why we end up with a separation from the Jewish people go one direction geographically, the Jewish people go another direction geographically, and that split geographically also had theological ramifications because we've never gotten back together. We've been reading two different types of Bibles. We've been separating, and so the Gentile side says, well, let's do Passover. But then we're not going to do Passover, we're going to do communion. We'll just take the elements of it and boil it down. Now what's interesting is you have Catholic scholars who are actually coming back and saying, you know what, actually this stuff has the Eucharist. There's a guy named Brent, B-R-A-N-T, and the last name is P-I-T-R-E. He's done a book basically saying the Hebraic background to the Holy Eucharist, and where he details historically. And by the way, the guy that's written the #1 book on Passover turns out he's a Catholic. Writing on Passover and doing the most detailed history I've seen on Passover. It's coming from Catholicism because they're starting to realize, whoa, this is coming out of these roots. Yes. No. Never. In fact, Yeshua says to his followers, he starts telling them, by the way, the closer he gets towards Jerusalem, he starts telling his followers, to the disciples, that he's going to die. And they start looking at him like, really? You're going to die? What's that about? I got to lay down my life. I've got to suffer. They didn't understand. If you go back to the Hebrew Scriptures, I got to tell you this on their behalf. When you look at the Hebrew Scriptures, there's texts that you can look at that talk about the Messiah suffering, and there's texts that you can look at and it talks about the Messiah ruling and reigning. So I don't put them down for thinking, hey, and by the way, if we were all under oppression and we were all being persecuted, we wouldn't want a Messiah that said, I'm going to come and suffer. Well, we're already suffering. That's not what we want. If you're going to identify with us, get on a horse, strap on a sword, and kick some butt. Get us out of here. To put it in the vernacular, get rid of the oppression. Don't be playing this martyr thing where, that doesn't do us any good. We're still under oppression. And by the way, we get all these texts that say the Messiah, when he comes, is going to rule and reign, and he's going to be exalted, and we're going to be the people. That works. You got texts like Psalm 22, Isaiah 53 that say he's going to suffer. This one is going to suffer. He's going to be pierced. Zechariah 14, we shall look upon him whom we have pierced. So you got the prophets talking about the piercing of God and the destruction, and we don't need that now. So the mindset of the people, which tells us something about ourselves. Maybe sometimes we read the Scriptures and go to them and see in them what we want to see. And we don't understand what's really there, or the complexity of what's there and the timing of what's there. By the way, it was in his death. Here's the irony. It was in his death that he would go back to the Father and be exalted. But he says, my kingdom is not of this world. I got a throne somewhere else, really, guys. And I'm going back to that throne. Okay? And yes, one day I will come back here and I will rule and reign here as well. But I'm leaving you here to make that happen in the meantime. But it's not for now. That's delayed. There is a coming, yes. And he said, what does he say to Martha? Hey, do you believe in the resurrection? Yeah, I believe it's coming. Okay. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. It's in me. But I gotta do some things in the meantime. I've got to suffer. I've got to atone. And I've got to defeat death. That's got to happen. I've got to demonstrate that I can go through death and come out the other side. That's got to happen first. Because one of the things he has to get rid of is disease, death, right? Those two things have to go. And demonic forces. He's got to prove, though, that he can control death and disease. So if whatever brings about death has to be undone. And he's the only one who can do it. So this has to happen first. Well, that wasn't understood by them. That the timing of it. And part of that is because of where they were at in their history. Our theology is oftentimes driven much more by our culture and by what we see in the culture, than what we actually see in the text. People are willing to believe things that are not in the Bible, or to deny things that are in the Bible, if the culture tells them this is what they should accept or not accept. Any other questions or comments? Just ask you to think about these things, and to this festival has so much to it. There's so much here, but to get into all of it, we don't see it all. But there's a lot here, and the fact that Yeshua uses this festival as to speak of his first coming, to use this festival tells us a lot about what's happening. And these festivals are important because they're the roadmap to everything that's happening. These festivals are huge as a roadmap to the first coming and the second coming. Can't escape those. Anyone else? Good questions. No bad questions, by the way. They're all good. I mean, we need to work through this. Anyone else? All right, Kirk.